The day I stopped waiting for his love was the day the king finally looked at me. For years, Ethan Bennett had believed that patience could change anything. He believed a kind word could soften a cold heart, that loyalty could erase doubt, and that love could grow even in the quietest corners of a palace. But after standing beside King Alexander Hayes for so long, Ethan finally understood one painful truth. Some hearts only notice your presence when they feel your absence. The grand halls of Eldoria were filled with beauty, but Ethan had never felt more alone than when he stood inside them. The marble floors, golden decorations, and endless royal ceremonies reminded him every day of the distance between him and the man who was supposed to be his husband. King Alexander was respected by everyone in the kingdom. He was intelligent, powerful, and admired by nobles and citizens alike. But when it came to Ethan, the king had always been distant. Their marriage had been created for political reasons, a connection between powerful families that brought stability to Eldoria. To the kingdom, Ethan was the king's consort. But to Alexander, he was only a responsibility. Ethan remembered every moment he tried to change that. The mornings when he waited for a conversation that never came. The evenings when he prepared thoughtful gestures only to receive a polite but empty response. The countless times he wondered what he needed to do differently. Maybe if he became more useful. Maybe if he became more patient. Maybe if he became someone easier to love. But one night, standing alone beside the palace windows and looking over the lights of the capital city, Ethan realized something that changed everything. He had spent so much time trying to become worthy of someone else's love that he had forgotten his own worth. The next morning, everything changed. When Alexander entered the royal dining hall, he expected to see the same Ethan who always looked toward him with hope. Instead, he found someone calm and composed, someone who no longer searched for a reaction. Ethan simply greeted him with respect. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Nothing more. No questions. No attempt to start a conversation. No hidden request for attention. Alexander paused. It was such a small difference, but somehow it felt impossible to ignore. "You seem different today," the king said. Ethan looked up from his breakfast and gave a quiet smile. "Perhaps I finally understand that I cannot force someone to see my value." The words were not angry. They were not meant to hurt. They were simply honest. For the first time in years, Alexander had no immediate answer. The king was used to people seeking his approval. He was used to others carefully choosing their words around him. But Ethan spoke with a calm confidence that felt unfamiliar. After breakfast, Ethan returned to his own schedule. He visited the royal library, walked through the gardens, and began learning about the kingdom he had spent so much time feeling separated from. He no longer measured his days by Alexander's attention. He no longer waited for a sign that might never come. And that was the first thing Alexander noticed. The person who had always been there was suddenly no longer reaching for him. Later that evening, the king stood outside the empty corridor leading to Ethan's rooms. He did not know why he had stopped there. He had wanted distance for years. He had believed that distance was easier. Yet now, for the first time, he wondered why the silence felt so different. Why did the palace feel slightly colder when Ethan was no longer trying to be close? And why did the man he once overlooked suddenly become the one person he could not stop thinking about? Ethan had spent years believing that the hardest part of his marriage was being ignored by the king. But he eventually discovered something even more difficult. It was accepting that he had been fighting for a place where he was never truly welcomed. The memories of his past life inside the palace remained clear. Every attempt to become closer to King Alexander had ended the same way. A polite response, a distant expression, a reminder that their relationship existed because of duty, not affection. When Ethan first became the king's consort, he believed time would change everything. He believed that if Alexander saw his sincerity, the walls between them would eventually disappear. He attended royal events beside him, learned the traditions of Eldoria, and tried to understand the man behind the crown. But the more he tried, the more invisible he felt. Alexander never openly treated him with cruelty. That was what made it harder. There were no dramatic arguments or obvious reasons to walk away. Instead, there was only a quiet distance that grew between them every day. The king was always respectful, always controlled, and always unreachable. Ethan slowly realized that being tolerated was not the same as being valued. That realization became the beginning of his change. After the morning when he stopped seeking Alexander's attention, Ethan began building a life that belonged to him. He spent more time in the royal library, studying the history of Eldoria and understanding the people he was supposed to represent. He visited the palace gardens, spoke with servants, and listened to stories from those who had lived in the kingdom for generations. For the first time, Ethan was not trying to become someone worthy of the king. He was simply becoming himself. The change did not go unnoticed. The palace staff noticed that the consort who once seemed desperate for approval had become calm and confident. The nobles noticed that Ethan no longer followed the king's every movement. And most importantly, Alexander noticed. During a royal meeting, Alexander found himself looking toward Ethan more than once. He expected to see the familiar expression of someone waiting for his attention. Instead, Ethan sat quietly, offering thoughtful opinions when asked and remaining silent when there was nothing to add. He was no longer trying to prove his importance. He already knew it. After the meeting ended, Alexander approached him. "You have been spending more time away from the royal court," the king said. Ethan looked at him calmly. "I have been spending more time understanding myself." The answer surprised Alexander. Before, Ethan would have explained everything in detail, hoping Alexander would understand. Now, he simply stated the truth and moved on. "Are you unhappy here?" Alexander asked. Ethan paused. The question was unexpected. "I am learning not to measure my happiness by whether someone else chooses me." For a moment, Alexander remained silent. Those words affected him because they revealed something he had never considered. Ethan had not become distant because he wanted to punish him. He had become distant because he had finally stopped hurting himself. That evening, Alexander returned to his private study but found it difficult to focus on his work. He remembered every small change. The way Ethan no longer waited outside meetings. The way he smiled without checking whether Alexander noticed. The way he seemed more alive when he stopped searching for approval. The king had once thought Ethan's attention was something he could always have. He assumed it would remain there no matter how often he ignored it. But now, standing alone in the quiet palace, Alexander felt a strange uncertainty. For the first time, he wondered if the person who had always been waiting for him was finally learning how to walk away. And that possibility disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. The first sign that something had changed was not a grand moment or a dramatic announcement. It was the silence. For years, King Alexander Hayes had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Nobles wanted influence. Advisors wanted approval. Citizens wanted protection. Everyone approached the king with a purpose. But Ethan Bennett had been the one person who always came to him without hiding his feelings. And now, Ethan had stopped. At first, Alexander told himself that the change was temporary. He believed Ethan would eventually return to the way he had always been. The king had spent years watching Ethan search for his attention, so he assumed that habit would never disappear. But each day that passed proved him wrong. Ethan was not pretending. He was truly moving forward. The royal library became his favorite place in the palace. Instead of waiting for invitations to stand beside Alexander at official events, Ethan used his time to understand Eldoria. He studied the kingdom's history, learned about its traditions, and listened to stories from people who had lived far beyond the palace walls. He was no longer simply the king's consort. He was becoming someone with his own identity. Alexander noticed every detail. He noticed how Ethan smiled more often. He noticed how confidently he spoke during meetings. He noticed how the palace servants seemed more comfortable around him. The strange part was that Ethan was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply being genuine. One afternoon, Alexander passed through the royal garden and saw Ethan speaking with a group of palace workers. The scene was ordinary, yet it caught his attention. Ethan listened carefully to their concerns and responded with kindness. There was no audience watching. No reason for Ethan to perform. He was just being himself. Alexander stood there longer than he intended, quietly observing. He remembered the version of Ethan he thought he knew. The person who always looked toward him for approval. The person who seemed to need his acceptance to feel complete. But the man standing in the garden was different. He looked peaceful. He looked free. That evening, Alexander invited Ethan to join him for tea in the western courtyard. It was a place where the king rarely spent time with anyone else. Ethan seemed slightly surprised by the invitation, but accepted politely. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Alexander spoke. "You seem happier lately." Ethan looked at him with a calm expression. "I think I am." The simple honesty caught Alexander off guard. "What changed?" Ethan looked toward the garden flowers moving gently in the evening breeze. I stopped waiting for something that was not mine to control. Alexander lowered his eyes. He understood the meaning behind those words. Ethan was no longer waiting for him to become a different person. He was no longer hoping that one day the king would suddenly notice him. "Do you no longer care what I think?" Alexander asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment before answering. "I care, but I finally understand that my worth does not depend on your opinion." The answer stayed with Alexander long after their conversation ended. Because for the first time, he realized Ethan's distance was not a punishment. It was not an attempt to make him jealous or gain attention. It was simply the result of someone choosing himself. Later that night, Alexander stood beside his office window overlooking the palace grounds. He saw a small light coming from the library where Ethan was still reading. A strange feeling settled in his chest. He had spent so long believing that Ethan's affection was something guaranteed, something that would always be there whenever he decided to accept it. But now, he was beginning to understand a truth he had ignored for too long. Even the most patient person could eventually stop waiting. And the king who once valued distance above everything else was starting to wonder what it would feel like if Ethan truly left that distance behind forever. For the first time in years, King Alexander Hayes began noticing the things that were no longer there. The quiet greetings from Ethan every morning. The thoughtful questions during royal events. The small moments when Ethan would look toward him, waiting for even the smallest sign of approval. Those moments had once felt ordinary, almost invisible. Now, their absence seemed impossible to ignore. Alexander had never imagined that silence could feel so powerful. He had spent years believing that distance between them was exactly what he wanted. He believed that a marriage built on duty did not need warmth. He believed emotions only created distractions from his responsibilities as king. But watching Ethan move forward without him forced Alexander to question everything he thought he understood. The palace continued its daily routine, but something about it felt different. Ethan was still respectful. He still attended important gatherings. He still carried himself with the dignity expected of the royal consort. Yet there was a freedom in the way he moved that Alexander had never seen before. Ethan was no longer trying to earn a place beside him. He already believed he belonged there. During a royal council meeting, Alexander noticed how the advisors listened when Ethan spoke. In the past, Ethan's opinions were often overlooked because people only remembered old rumors about him. But now, they were beginning to recognize his patience, intelligence, and genuine concern for the kingdom. The western provinces have requested more support for their agricultural programs, Ethan explained calmly. A small investment now could create stability for many families in the future. Alexander watched him carefully. Ethan was not speaking to impress anyone. He was speaking because he believed it was the right thing to do. After the meeting ended, Alexander remained seated longer than usual. He found himself replaying Ethan's words in his mind. He had once thought Ethan only cared about becoming closer to the throne. But perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps Ethan had always cared about the people around him, and Alexander had simply refused to see it. Later that afternoon, Alexander walked through the palace gardens and found Ethan near the fountain. The sunlight reflected across the water, creating a peaceful atmosphere. Ethan was reading a book, completely unaware that the king was watching him. "You spend a lot of time alone now," Alexander said. Ethan looked up with a small smile. "I enjoy my own company." The answer was simple, but Alexander felt the difference. Before, Ethan would have immediately asked why he was there. Before, Ethan would have searched for a deeper meaning behind the conversation. Now, he simply accepted the moment. "Do you not miss how things used to be?" Alexander asked. Ethan closed the book slowly. "Which part?" The question caught Alexander off guard. Ethan continued. "The part where I was always trying to prove myself? The part where I wondered if I was important enough." His voice remained calm. There was no anger, only honesty. "No, Your Majesty. I do not miss that." Alexander looked away. Those words hurt more than he expected, not because Ethan wanted to hurt him, but because they were true. For the first time, Alexander understood that he had not only created distance. He had created a place where Ethan eventually learned how to live without him. That evening, the king returned to his office and found himself unable to concentrate. The documents in front of him remained untouched while his thoughts returned to one person. Ethan had changed because he had finally stopped waiting. And now Alexander was the one waiting. Waiting for a conversation. waiting for a smile, waiting for the attention he once assumed would always belong to him. The realization was uncomfortable, but impossible to deny. The king who once believed he had no need for Ethan's affection was beginning to understand the value of the very thing he had taken for granted. Ethan had never expected that the most difficult part of letting go would be watching someone finally notice him. For so long, he had dreamed of the day King Alexander would see his efforts, understand his feelings, and recognize that he was more than just a political obligation. But now that Alexander was beginning to pay attention, Ethan found himself uncertain. The person who had once waited endlessly for a sign of affection was no longer the same person. He had learned how to stand on his own. He had learned that peace did not have to come from someone else choosing him. Meanwhile, Alexander was slowly discovering the truth behind the rumors that had followed Ethan for years. He realized that many stories about the royal consort were incomplete, shaped by assumptions rather than reality. The king had spent so much time believing he knew Ethan that he never considered the possibility that he had been wrong. That changed during a royal visit to one of Eldoria's smaller regions. Ethan accompanied Alexander, not as someone seeking approval, but as a member of the royal family who genuinely wanted to understand the people. The journey showed Alexander a side of Ethan he had never noticed before. Ethan spoke with villagers, listened to their concerns, and remembered small details about their lives. He did not act like someone trying to gain admiration. He acted like someone who cared. At one point, a local family expressed gratitude for the attention the royal consort had given to their community. Ethan simply smiled and said, "Everyone deserves to be heard." Alexander stood nearby, quietly observing. Those words stayed with him. He had spent years thinking Ethan wanted recognition because of his position, but now he understood something different. Ethan did not want power. He wanted connection. On the journey back to the palace, Alexander remained unusually quiet. He looked out the carriage window, thinking about every moment he had misunderstood. He remembered the times Ethan tried to speak with him and the times he had dismissed those attempts without consideration. He remembered how easily he had accepted the opinions of others because it was simpler than discovering the truth himself. "You are quiet today," Ethan said gently. Alexander looked toward him. "I am thinking." Ethan gave a small smile. "That sounds serious." For a moment, Alexander almost smiled as well. It was a simple interaction, but it felt different from their conversations in the past. There was no tension, no expectation, just two people speaking honestly. When they returned to the palace, Alexander noticed another change. The way people looked at Ethan had shifted. The servants respected him. The advisors valued his opinions. Even the nobles who once questioned him had begun to reconsider their assumptions. Yet Ethan did not seem interested in proving anyone wrong. He simply continued living as himself. That was what affected Alexander the most. Ethan had gained respect without chasing it. He had found confidence without needing approval. That night, Alexander stood in his office, looking at the empty chair across from his desk. He remembered how often Ethan had sat there in the past, trying to create moments together. Back then, Alexander had seen those moments as interruptions. Now, he wished he could return to them. But time did not move backward. The only thing he could do was change what came next. For the first time, Alexander admitted a truth he had avoided for too long. He had not lost Ethan because someone took him away. He had almost lost him because he never realized how precious he was while he was still there. Alexander had always believed that being a king meant knowing when to hold on and when to let go. But recently, he discovered that there was one thing he did not want to lose, even though he was the one who had pushed it away. Ethan had become different, and the king could no longer pretend that he did not notice. The palace felt different because Ethan was different. The quiet halls where Ethan once waited for him now felt strangely empty. The royal meetings where Ethan once tried to share his thoughts now felt incomplete without his voice. Alexander began searching for moments that he had once ignored. A simple conversation during breakfast, a walk through the gardens, a few minutes where they could speak without the weight of their titles between them. The realization surprised him. He had spent so much time creating distance that he never considered what would happen when Ethan finally accepted that distance. One morning, Alexander entered the dining hall and saw Ethan already seated with a book beside him. The scene was familiar, yet something about it felt new. Ethan looked peaceful. He was not waiting. He was not watching the door. He was simply enjoying his morning. "You have been spending more time in the library," Alexander said as he took his seat. Ethan looked up and smiled politely. I enjoy learning about Eldoria. Alexander studied him for a moment. You never seemed interested in these things before. Ethan closed the book gently. Maybe I was too focused on trying to be noticed. The honesty of the answer made Alexander pause. There was no bitterness in Ethan's voice. That was what made it more powerful. Ethan was not trying to remind him of past mistakes. He was simply acknowledging the truth. Later that day, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. He asked Ethan to join a royal discussion about the future of several regions in Eldoria. It was not because tradition required the consort to attend. It was because Alexander wanted to hear Ethan's opinion. During the meeting, Ethan offered thoughtful ideas and listened carefully to every perspective. Alexander noticed how naturally Ethan connected with others. He did not demand attention. He earned respect through sincerity. After the meeting, one of the advisors commented, "The royal consort has changed greatly." Alexander looked toward Ethan walking through the palace corridor. "No," he said quietly. "Perhaps we simply never saw him clearly before." The words surprised the advisor, but they surprised Alexander even more. For years, he had defended his own assumptions about Ethan. Now, he was beginning to question them. That evening, Alexander found Ethan in the garden. The sunset painted the palace walls with warm golden light, and the peaceful atmosphere made the conversation feel different from the past. "I want to ask you something," Alexander said. Ethan looked at him. Of course. Alexander hesitated. It was unusual for a man who commanded an entire kingdom to struggle with a simple question. "Do you still believe there is nothing between us?" Ethan remained quiet for a moment. "I believe there is a lot we never understood about each other." The answer was gentle, but it carried distance. Alexander realized Ethan was not closing the door completely, but he was also not standing there waiting for him anymore. "I want to understand you," Alexander said. Ethan looked surprised. "Why now?" Alexander had heard that question before, but this time he needed to answer it honestly. "Because I finally realized I was looking at you without truly seeing you." The garden became quiet. For the first time, Alexander was not speaking as a king. He was speaking as a person who regretted the years he had wasted. Ethan looked at him carefully, searching for certainty. And Alexander understood something important. Earning Ethan's trust would not happen with a single conversation. It would require patience, the same patience Ethan had once given him. But this time, Alexander was willing to be the one who waited. Alexander had spent years believing that a king's greatest responsibility was protecting the stability of his kingdom. But now he faced a different kind of challenge. He had to prove that his change was real, not just a temporary feeling caused by regret. Ethan had given him patience once, and Alexander knew he could not expect that patience to return simply because he finally understood its value. Trust was not something he could demand. It was something he had to rebuild. The palace slowly began to notice the change between them. The king who once avoided spending time with his consort now included him in important discussions. The man who once dismissed Ethan's opinions now listened carefully. But not everyone was pleased with the transformation. Some members of the royal court believed Ethan's growing influence was a threat. They remembered the old rumors. They remembered the assumptions that had followed him for years. During a formal council meeting, several nobles questioned whether Ethan truly deserved his position beside the king. The role of the royal consort carries great responsibility, one noble said carefully. Many people still wonder whether he is prepared for such expectations. Ethan remained calm. He had heard similar doubts before. The difference was that he no longer felt the need to prove himself to everyone. He knew who he was. Before Ethan could answer, Alexander spoke. "The royal consort has shown his dedication through his actions, not through rumors." The room became quiet. The nobles looked toward the king with surprise. Alexander continued, "I judged him based on assumptions for too long. I will not allow the same mistake to continue." Ethan looked at Alexander, unable to hide his surprise. This was not the distant king from before. This was someone willing to acknowledge his own mistakes publicly. After the meeting, Ethan and Alexander walked through the palace corridor together. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan said, "You did not have to defend me." Alexander looked at him. "I know." "Then why did you?" Ethan asked. Alexander thought about the answer. Months ago, he might have given a response based on duty. He might have said it was necessary for the kingdom. But now he understood that honesty mattered more. Because it was the truth. Ethan looked away, quietly processing those words. Alexander continued. I spent too much time believing I knew who you were. I listened to others before I listened to you. His voice became softer. I do not want to make that mistake again. The sincerity in his words was difficult for Ethan to ignore. Still, he remained careful. The wounds created by years of distance did not disappear overnight. But something had changed. The two of them were no longer standing on opposite sides of an invisible wall. They were finally standing in the same place, trying to understand each other. That evening, Alexander returned to his office and looked over the reports from the kingdom. Normally, his attention would have been completely focused on political matters. Instead, his thoughts returned to Ethan. He remembered the first days of their marriage, when Ethan had looked at him with hope. He remembered how easily he had ignored those moments. Now, he understood that Ethan's silence had never been an attempt to punish him. It was simply the result of someone who had learned how to live without being chosen. And that realization made Alexander more determined than ever. He did not want Ethan to simply remain by his side because of duty. He wanted Ethan to choose him. For the first time in his life, the king understood what it meant to truly fear losing something precious. For the first time in many years, King Alexander Hayes no longer feared losing control of his kingdom. He feared losing the one person who had once been standing beside him, waiting for him to notice. Ethan had changed everything without trying to change anything. He had not demanded an apology. He had not asked for attention. He had simply chosen himself, and that choice forced Alexander to finally see the truth he had ignored for so long. The king who once believed emotions were a weakness had discovered that understanding someone required something far more difficult than authority. It required humility. In the days that followed, Alexander continued trying to rebuild the connection between them. He no longer approached Ethan as a responsibility or a duty. He approached him as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. Ethan noticed the difference, but he remained cautious. He had spent too long protecting himself to suddenly forget everything that happened before. One evening, Alexander invited Ethan to walk through the palace gardens. The same gardens where Ethan had once admitted that he could not force someone to see his value. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was no sadness between them. Only two people trying to understand the distance that had existed for so long. I have been thinking about what you said, Alexander began. Ethan looked at him. Which part? Alexander took a moment before answering. That you cannot force someone to see your worth. Ethan remained quiet. Alexander continued. I think I spent years believing I was the only one with the right to decide what mattered. I thought because I was king, I understood everything around me. He looked toward the garden paths ahead. But I was wrong. Those words surprised Ethan. Alexander Hayes was a man known throughout Eldoria for his confidence and certainty. Hearing him admit a mistake felt almost impossible. Why are you telling me this now? Ethan asked. Alexander looked back at him. Because I do not want you to believe that I only value you because I am afraid of losing you. Ethan studied his expression carefully. Then why? Alexander answered honestly. Because I finally understand who you are. The simple statement carried more meaning than a grand promise. For years, Ethan had wanted Alexander to see him. Not as a political connection. Not as a rumor. Not as a person defined by mistakes from the past. Just as Ethan. And now, finally, the king was looking at him clearly. I cannot change the years we lost, Alexander said. But I can choose what I do with the time we have now. Ethan looked away, allowing himself a moment to process the words. Part of him wanted to believe them immediately. Another part remembered all the times he had hoped for change before. Trust was fragile. It could not be repaired by one conversation. But Alexander was different now. He was not asking Ethan to forget the past. He was acknowledging it. That mattered. As they continued walking, the distance between them felt smaller than before. Not because everything had been solved, but because they were finally honest with each other. Later that night, Alexander stood alone in his office and looked out over the palace lights. He remembered the person Ethan had been when they first met. Someone who gave kindness even when he received little in return. Someone who stayed patient even when he felt unseen. Alexander finally understood the greatest mistake he had made. He had mistaken Ethan's patience for something permanent. He had assumed that because Ethan cared, he would always be there. But love was not something anyone could take for granted. It was something that had to be protected. And now the king knew one thing with absolute certainty. He did not want Ethan beside him because of tradition. He wanted him there because life felt different when Ethan was part of it. Ethan Bennett never imagined that the place where he once felt the most alone would become the place where he finally found peace. The Palace of Eldoria had once represented everything he could not have. A home that did not feel like home. A marriage without warmth. A life where he constantly questioned whether he was enough. But now, standing beside King Alexander Hayes, Ethan saw something different. Not a perfect story. Not a story without mistakes. But a story where two people finally chose to understand each other. The change did not happen overnight. It was built through small moments. Through honest conversations. Through the simple decision to listen instead of assume. Alexander had learned that being a king did not mean he was always right. Sometimes, the greatest strength came from admitting when he was wrong. Ethan had learned that being loved was not something he needed to earn by sacrificing himself. He had value before anyone recognized it. The kingdom of Eldoria slowly noticed the difference between them. The cold distance that once surrounded the royal couple had disappeared. They worked together during royal meetings. They walked through the gardens without needing a reason. They shared conversations that were no longer filled with uncertainty. One evening, months after everything began to change, Alexander found Ethan standing near the palace balcony, watching the city lights below. The view was peaceful, and the quiet moment reminded Ethan of how much his life had changed. Alexander walked beside him. "Do you still think about leaving?" he asked softly. Ethan looked at him with a small smile. "Sometimes I think about how different everything could have been." Alexander lowered his gaze. "I understand." There was no defensiveness in his voice. Only acceptance. Ethan continued. "But I also think about how much we have changed." Alexander looked at him. "You changed first." Ethan smiled slightly. "Maybe, but you chose to change too." Those words meant more to Alexander than Ethan realized. Because that was the truth. Ethan had shown him a different way to live. A way where power was not the only thing that mattered. A way where trust was more valuable than control. "I spent so much time thinking I had to protect myself from losing things," Alexander said quietly. "But I never considered that I could lose something because I refused to hold on to it." Ethan remained silent, listening. Alexander continued. "I do not want you beside me because of a title or because of an agreement made years ago. I want you beside me because you are the person who makes this place feel less empty." The honesty of those words created a quiet moment between them. Ethan remembered the person he used to be. The person who waited for a single sign of affection. The person who believed he had to prove he deserved happiness. That person had not disappeared. He had simply grown. He had learned that love was not about convincing someone to choose him. It was about finding someone who chose him freely. From that day forward, the relationship between the king and his consort became something the kingdom had never expected. Not a partnership built only on duty, but a connection built on respect, trust, and understanding. Alexander was still a king. Ethan was still his consort. But beyond their titles, they were two people who had finally seen each other clearly. The man who once stood at a distance became the person who never wanted to let Ethan feel alone again. And Ethan, who once wondered if he would ever be valued, finally understood that his worth had been there all along. Sometimes, the greatest changes do not come from forcing someone to love you. Sometimes, they come from choosing yourself and allowing someone else to finally see the person you have always been.